Welcome to the second part of the 10 Methods lecture for Parkway North's AP World History class. I'm Scott Nilsson, and in this session we're going to return to the question that we first discussed last time. How did ancient rulers who had power keep it? In the first part, we talked about 4 methods: military power, social stratification, legal codes, and writing. In this part, we'll talk about the final 6 methods: monumental architecture, urban planning, art, literature, trade, and religion. So without further ado, let's begin with monumental architecture. If you're slightly more subtle about it, you can engineer ways of dominating your society by how you configure your living space. In part, this is about the buildings that you create. There's a reason that folks in charge of societies from time immemorial have lived in big fancy palaces. It conveys a sense of power and authority that simply isn't available to the peasants living in their huts. Overawing the local yokels is a cost-effective way of keeping them in line. This extends to other buildings than just palaces, though. These civilizations have a rich tradition of building truly awe-inspiring monumental structures. These tended to be temple complexes or tombs, though there were variations based on the particular civilization as well. In part, these served the same purpose as the palaces, to inspire awe and deference to those who controlled them. But in order to construct these monuments, these societies had to be organized in such a way that a huge workforce was compelled to labor on them, which is an explicit way of demonstrating your authority. A populace that is exhausted from building these monuments isn't one that's able to rise up against their rulers. Urban planning. Part of organizing your living space is also deciding what goes where, too. The principle of urban planning, essentially deciding how to organize the space within your city, was also a useful tool in maintaining power. This worked on a couple levels. First, you could decide to use urban planning as a way of signaling power. You could choose to have the central feature of a city be the seat of power, whether that was a temple or a palace or whatever. Then those areas closest were reserved for the most powerful, and the buildings were also more beautiful and grand. As you go farther away from the seat of power, the buildings become less and less beautiful, and the people living in them get less and less rich and powerful. Accordingly, if you simply walk about the city going to, say, a religious ceremony or the like, you get a very clear idea of where the power lies in the city. And maybe, even more importantly, you get a sense of where you belong and where you don't. Second, if the powers that be within those societies had the power to regulate what got built where, then they had a huge say over how people could live their lives. Denying somebody the ability to live as they choose is a serious demonstration of power, and if used judiciously, could be an effective tool in terms of controlling the rest of society. Art. This same concept of using some sort of powerful visuals to reinforce the glory and majesty of those in power works in other mediums too. And generally when we talk about visuals, we're really talking about art. Much of what art remains from this time period is in the form of statues and other carvings, but they tell the same story as the monumental architecture. That is, those who are in power are so grand, so powerful, that anything other than obedience is simply unthinkable. This message doesn't have to be overt. In most cases, the message is sufficiently clear that it doesn't have to be made explicit. Literature. The same concept in yet another medium comes through the stories we've received from these civilizations. Let's call this literature, though it's not literature in the way that we think of it today. It's not like there's mass market paperbacks waiting to be consumed in all those ancient civilizations. What there were, though, were stories. Stories that have been told and retold for literally thousands of years as forms of entertainment, education, and religious instruction. When they were eventually written down, then we called them literature, but the stories themselves have been around for far longer. These stories tend to have similar focuses. Generally, there are gods, and there are powerful rulers, and sometimes they fight with each other, and sometimes they fight against other people or gods, but in each case, the power of those gods and kings is unquestioned. There is not a rich tradition of ancient stories glorying the peasant farmers who rose up and overthrew the kings in their cities. Quite the opposite, actually. The Epic of Gilgamesh has that confrontation going the other way. These stories can't help but reinforce the idea that those in power ought to have that power. In fact, that the world can't operate in any other way. Trade. However much the stories tell you that the king is great and awesome and has everything taken care of, that doesn't make it true, necessarily. No area is self-sufficient. There will always be shortfalls or other things which are desired but unavailable locally. A way to remedy this is to have a healthy trading system. You give up some of what you have that others want, and you get some of what others have that you want. From the ruler's point of view, this tends to reinforce power in a couple ways too. First, people get what they need or desire, which makes them happy. A happy populace is far less to rise up in a violent revolt, which is good news if you're in charge. Second, part of the nice thing about being in charge is that you have more money than pretty much anyone else. So through trade, you can purchase the finest, nicest, whatever, clothes, jewelry, servants, whatever you have in mind. This kind of conspicuous consumption serves the same purpose as the monumental architecture, the urban planning, and the arts. It visually reinforces the gulf between the ruler and the ruled in terms of both resources and power, and helps preserve the control of those that have it. Religion. The final method is another of the most powerful, so much so that we'll talk about variations of it throughout the entirety of the course. It's part of the human condition that vast amounts of things are out of our control. Weather, natural disasters, and sickness and disease, just to name a very few. It's natural to ascribe control over these uncontrollable forces to some higher power, some god or gods. And generally the way to prevent bad things from happening to you, then, is to make those gods happy. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, which gods and which ways to make them happy are unimportant. We will talk a lot more about specific religions and how they work in period 2, so you have that to look forward to. All of the religions in this time worked in more or less the same way, though, for the purposes of intersecting with political power. The big trump card the ruler could play was to say, look, I'm in charge because the gods want me to be in charge. If you mess with me, you're going to make the gods unhappy. That's a really bad idea, so just let me stay in power and everybody stays happy. This introduces a number of complications to the situation, particularly when A, the religious authority and the political authority are not the same person. There's lots of potential for drama and controversy there. Or B, the natural disasters and the things which the ruler had promised to keep away come anyway. In a lot of ways, this is a high-risk, high-reward strategy. If it works, it's the most powerful method available. If it doesn't, then you as the ruler have given everyone else the excuse they need to remove you from power. It won't take all that much thought for you to see that these 10 methods of keeping power are so effective that we're still using them today. This is one of the neat things about studying world history. With a little thought, you can start to recognize the patterns of interaction that seem to reoccur over and over throughout the human experience. You start to learn how humans work, and you can't really use something effectively until you know how it works. This concludes the lectures for period 1, the time period stretching from about 10,000 years ago to about 600 BCE. As a preview in period 2, which covers from 600 BCE to 600 CE, we'll discuss the development of most of the world's major religions, the creation of newer and larger empires, including how they were run and why they fell apart, and the growing interconnectedness of the world through the development of 4 major trade networks. Thank you, and I'll talk to you then.